You're listening to the Trinity podcast. We are a multi-site church in the Chicago area whose mission is to help you look, live, and love more like Jesus.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our midweek podcast episodes. These are the episodes in our podcast when we take some time to meditate a little bit more on what we've been learning from the weekend. We are in the middle of a series that we are calling How to Inhabit Time, looking at the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, and we're really going to be using this week to meditate a little bit on Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And with me on the podcast this week is our Director of Worship Arts, Erica Mertz. Erica, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, it's good to have you. We are halfway through the series, actually, at this point. Mm-hmm. And so I would just love to hear from you. What are some things that you've been learning in this journey through Ecclesiastes, and why do you feel like this book is such an important book for us to study?
Yeah, I think even just right off the bat, the title of our series, How to Inhabit Time, kind of gets at this maybe inner struggle or pull that we all have. But I've loved the past few weeks as we've been talking about hevel, which is like vapor or smoke. And because I think we can all feel that, like, what is the significance of the things that we're doing on earth? Or we can feel kind of that weight. And so it's kind of put some language to, I guess, the human experience. But yeah, that things are vapor. And what are the things that really do last forever? So yeah, I've been loving this series so far. I love this book too.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's one of those ideas, I think, that really very clearly describes our lived experience.
Yeah.
But often when we read it in English, we kind of miss the significance of that because a lot of our English translations translate that Hebrew word hevel meaningless or vanity, and that's really not the idea. And so it's been fun that we actually have gone back into the Hebrew and we've said, no, it really means like smoke or mist or vapor. John Walton talks about it as a mirage. He says, it looks like it has form, it looks like you can kind of figure it out, but the moment you think you've got a handle on life or you've figured life out, it shifts, it changes, it slips through your fingers. And that's actually an important idea, I think, for us as modern people to come to terms with, because we tend to look for permanence and meaning in impermanent things.
Yeah.
And that's why we decided to tackle this book.
Yeah, I think even it kind of hits on our American culture. Like, we could be tempted to put all our hope in our work or in our wealth or whatever it is. And so it hasn't been saying, oh, those things have absolutely no value. But I think it has caused me to really, what is my relationship to those things? Like, how much value do I put on that compared to the eternal value of Jesus? So it's felt really relevant so far.
One of the things that I've enjoyed is, preaching through this series and then worshiping on the weekends, seeing how you and your team have put together the songs and some of the music around this series. As you've been meditating on Ecclesiastes, have there been certain songs that have really, you're like, this song actually kind of gets at what the writer of Ecclesiastes is wanting us to reflect on?
That's a really good question. We sang a song this past week that really was tugging at my heartstrings. It's called Jireh. And Jireh just means my God will provide. And in the message, you kind of led us to this place of, we want to put all our hope in all of these other things, but at the end of the day, like, our relationship with Jesus truly is enough. And so in that chorus, we were singing over and over, Jireh, you are enough. Jireh, you are enough. There's also a funny moment this past weekend where I forgot to turn my microphone on. And so I started singing and my microphone was off. And then I turned it on and the first words that I sang were, I've never been more loved than I am right now. It was just kind of this funny moment to remind myself that I'm human, that God is God, that He is enough. So that's been one in particular that's kind of stood out to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about chapter 3. Okay. This is, if anybody is at all familiar with Ecclesiastes, they might be familiar with this section of the book. It has two very famous verses. Verse 1, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Verse 11, which actually most of us only know part of, which is He, referring to God, has put eternity into man's heart. But beyond that, most people aren't familiar with this book. Mm-hmm. So it's of all of Ecclesiastes, probably the one we're most familiar with, but also understand the least.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about it. Let's talk about how do we understand this text and why does it matter. So, the first portion of the passage, verses 1-8, talks about seasons, talks about the fact that there's a time for every matter under heaven. As you kind of read through that, what is something that stands out to you, especially as you kind of reflect on each of those verses? Are there certain themes that you see kind of emerging? What does this passage say to you?
Yeah, it is interesting. So just looking at this first section, even on the page, it almost looks like a list.
Yeah.
And it seems at first glance like there's a positive section to each one and then a negative section. So a time to break down and a time to build up. I would probably choose the time to build up, or a time to weep and a time to laugh. I would choose the time to laugh. So it's kind of just makes me ask the question, what do I do with this? How do we live according to this list? And there can be some confusing parts to this too, but I think as the teaching team was kind of showing us, my first instinct would be, this is something I have to do or control based on this list, but y'all helped us to kind of see that this is more the reality of what we live in, and these are the seasons and things that sort of happen to us. And then by God's wisdom, he helps us to react or live in that season. So that kind of reframed how I thought about this list of positives and negatives, I guess.
Yeah, I think that is one of the temptations that we run into when we look at this, because we see positive things. We're like, oh, are those the things we're supposed to do?
Yeah.
But then there's a whole lot of other stuff, like he says a time to hate, a time for war, a time to kill in verse 3. It's like, wait a second, that doesn't sound like the Beatitudes. That doesn't sound like something Jesus would have us do. And I really do think that's why I like the language of season, right? Because as much as we would want to, we can't control the seasons of nature. They just happen. There's just these cycles, right? You have winter and summer. You have spring and fall. They just happen. And really, I think what the writer of Ecclesiastes is getting at is this idea of like, there are also seasons in life.
Yep.
And just as you can't control the seasons of nature, you can't control the seasons of life. These are things that will happen in kind of this broken world we live in. There's going to be high points. There's going to be hard times. There's going to be mountaintop experiences. There's going to be very, very dark valleys. And so he's saying, you just got to know that's going to happen.
Yeah.
You just got to know that they're coming. Yeah. And I do think that there's wisdom in that, right? Is because I think our temptation with those is with the positive ones, we want to like cling to them.
Yep.
Like, I just want to keep the good times rolling, good vibes only. I'll see that like outside of a coffee shop, they'll have the little like sandwich board and it's just like good vibes only. But then I get in there and people are spilling their coffee and some parent's kid is like destroying, the sugar packets or something. Right. And it's chaos, and it's just like as much as we'd want good times to keep going, they don't. But likewise, we can kind of get crushed by the hard times. We think we get into those really difficult moments in life when we don't think that there's an end in sight.
Yeah.
And so we get stuck there and we kind of despair over those. And really what he's saying neither one is eternal. Yep. There are going to be these ebbs and flows, and it's important for you as a person to know that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that just gives me a lot of hope too. I'm thinking of when Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Because sometimes in those good times, like you were saying, I can want to, okay, what can I do to just savor this? This is a good season, life is going well. I would like to do everything I can to control this so that this good season just continues. But reading it this way reminds us that so much of life is out of our control. So then I can approach it with more open hands, and then I don't have to be so surprised when difficult times do come up, because they will. But then we can enter into those difficult seasons with faith and with prayer and just have a different mindset when those tough times come.
Yeah. So let's talk about how we live in those seasons, because that's really what chapter 3 verses 9 to 15 is all about. As we were preparing for this message as a teaching team, one of the things that I was telling the team was, verses 9 to 15 teach us how to live with verses 1 to 8.
Yep.
Verses 1 to 8, this is just life. Life is going to happen in this world of Hevel where everything's shifting and changing. But 9 to 15 is where we really find wisdom for living life in season. So as you were reading over 9 to 15, were there certain verses that either stood out as like, wow, that provides a lot of wisdom, or that is really confusing? So as you looked at that, like, what were some of the passages that jumped out to you?
All right, that's great. I'll start with one of my favorite parts of it, and then I'll go to what felt a little bit confusing. Verse 14 really stood out to me as just something beautiful to cling to. It says, I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. Especially in the previous chapters, we've been talking about Hevel. Everything is smoke and vapor. And then all of a sudden, the author comes in with, here is something that is not Hevel, something that is secure and firm. And whatever the Lord establishes, that will endure forever. And I just found a lot of hope in that. And it was a really cool contrast to kind of the rest of the book leading up to this. Something that I found confusing, or just kind of made me think, was in verse 11. So it says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, which is great if I just stop right there. But then when it goes on, it says, yet, so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. The first half of this verse, I think I understand until we get to the second half of the verse, and then it gets a little more confusing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, too.
Yeah, this is again, is one of those passages, if anybody's familiar with anything from Ecclesiastes, it's probably from here.
Yeah.
There's only really one other portion of Ecclesiastes now that I think about it that a lot of people are familiar with, and that's later on in the book. But many people know this part, right? God has put eternity in a man's heart. So we're like, oh, see, we're destined for eternity. And that's true.
Yep.
That is positive. That is encouraging to know that that life under the sun isn't all there is, that there is more.
Yeah.
But we tend to stop there, and there's the rest of the verse where it says, yet, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I actually think that when you read the entire verse, you really start to appreciate the wisdom that the preacher is bringing to how we live in season. Because on the one hand, he's putting his finger on why we're not satisfied with life under the sun. It's because we're meant for eternity, and we have this sense within us that we're longing for something more.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like what C.S. Lewis said. He says, we feel hunger because there is such a thing as food. We feel, sexual desire because there is such a thing as sex. A duck has this instinct to swim because there's such a thing as water. Like we have these desires within us because there is something that satisfies those desires. And then he says, and therefore, if I have a desire within me that nothing in this world can satisfy, then the only logical answer is that I'm designed for something more than this world.
Yeah.
And so this is what the preacher is saying. He's like, yeah, we have this desire for eternity within us. But then he goes on, he says, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end. He's also then putting his finger on the fact that we're still time-bound creatures, though.
Yeah.
We still live in this world, and we don't see the whole story. We don't know where my beginning to end fits in the larger, grander sweep of eternity. And that's actually important to be able to say that, because especially in the hard times, I think that we feel the pressure to come up with an answer for why. And oftentimes our answers are really bad answers. We come up with bad answers for bad situations, and they can sometimes do more harm than good. We encounter a person who's got that terrible diagnosis, or that person who experienced wickedness and injustice at the hands of somebody who was an oppressor. And we're trying to be like, there must be a reason why this is happening. And really, actually, we get into this in the book of Job, right? Job is going through all the suffering. His friends try to give him answers, and the answers suck. They're like, well, you must have sinned. So whatever you're getting, you deserve. Or, there must be a reason that you can't understand. Like, it's going to turn out for good. And Job is just like, how? It just keeps seeming to go from bad to worse. Like, these answers don't actually satisfy. And what I think the preacher is getting at here is he's saying, don't try to come up with the answer for every single season. Because you're time bound, you just don't know. But God does.
Yeah.
And so I think the wisdom there is to say, I know that there's an eternity, even though I don't have answers for my present circumstances. And the preacher's really trying to help us get to a place where we say, I may not understand God's ways, but I do trust his character. I may not understand his plans, but I have confidence in his purposes. And so that actually gets to the verse that you said I got a lot of comfort out of, which is verse 14, right? Although I might not understand everything, what God is doing does endure forever.
Yes.
The bigger story that my beginning to end fits in has a grander design that I can't perceive right now. But because I know him, I can be a lot more patient in the midst of the ebbs and flows of the seasons, and the highs and the hard times. So I actually love when you start to read verse 11 that way. I love it. Actually, it's a great verse, but it's better than what we typically tend to think of when we only take half of it and try to have it make sense. So
Right. Yeah, it really contrasts, I am finite and I'm within the bounds of time, but God is so above time and he's infinite, which allows me to put my trust in him even more when there are tough circumstances that I don't understand.
have you found practical moments where that kind of wisdom has been helpful for you?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying about the character of God. I can think of times in my life, and I know everyone has had this, where challenging things happen, and you first try to start reasoning, like maybe there's a reason this person passed away, and you kind of try to put pieces together, but usually to no success because it just doesn't make any sense. So I think this helps me because the thing that is consistent is the character of God. And even though I may not always understand his plans or purposes, or I may not understand why we live in a corrupt, evil world, the thing that I can get a grasp of is the goodness and faithfulness of his character, and that is also eternal. So for me, in the challenging times, that's really what I cling to.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've found, and the reason why I appreciate this verse, is because sometimes I think, especially in hard times, what I find is I've often gotten, I've become too dependent on a certain outcome. That really what I'm hoping for and hoping in is that there will be a certain outcome.
Yeah.
A predetermined outcome that I have in my head. And oftentimes I will catch myself in hard times praying for that outcome. Lord, just rescue me from this, make this happen, so on and so forth. But in those moments, I'm really trusting more in an outcome than I'm trusting in him as a person. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful about this verse is saying, what am I really hoping for? Am I hoping in God, or am I hoping in some sort of predetermined solution?
Yeah.
Is it really that I want God to bless my desires and outcomes, or do I desire God for God's sake? And really what the preacher's getting at is he's saying, you need to trust in God and desire God for God's sake, not for your own. Because actually, and now we're getting more to Jesus, Jesus actually tells us that when he talks about following him, right? He says, anyone who would seek to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will, in Matthew's gospel, he says, find it. In Mark and in Luke, it's will save it. He's saying when you actually start to desire God for God, you're actually starting to live for what you were always really meant for, what you were always designed to live for. We were made in his image. We're designed for relationship with him. And so don't cling to your predetermined outcome. Long for the one in whose image you're made. And that's really what I think the preacher is starting to get at. And that helps me to totally reframe and saying, like, am I really seeing God in this moment? What is it that I desire of him? And I realize even that question of what do I desire of him is even that is the wrong question. It's like, do I just want him?
Yes.
And that's the invitation, I think, of a passage like Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11.
Yeah, that's so good. And gosh, with that reminder of, fixing our eyes on him and his character, I think too, what we're praying for, just, get me out of this situation. And I think it's okay to be, specific in our prayers like that. But I think there's also an invitation for the Lord to do a work in us so that, whichever, if I'm on either the good side of this list or the negative side of this list, that the Lord, by His Holy Spirit, can actually form us to have a steadiness so that whether it's the really tough times or the really good times, I've built my life on the firm foundation of Jesus. That's another song that we've sang during this series that has really helped to ground me, because then He will do that work in us to give us the strength, no matter if it's a good time or if it's a bad time, if it's a good season or a challenging season.
Yeah, I think it also helps me, this whole passage, chapter 3, verses 1 all the way to 15, it helps me by giving me permission to also be emotionally honest in seasons. I think sometimes in hard times I feel like I have to come up with a reason or a good outcome or something like that. And what that does is it doesn't allow me to be really honest, actually, in my relationships and in my prayers of the fact that this sucks.
Yeah.
That this hard time really is hard, that losing a loved one is not the way it's supposed to be, that being sick with an incurable disease is not the way it's supposed to be, that injustice is not the way it's supposed to be. We feel like we have to explain away the brokenness almost. And this takes all the pressure off. It says, no, you can be honest with God that this is painful.
Yeah.
You can be honest with the people around you that this isn't right. You can be honest with yourself that this hurts. And I think, again, if God's desire is to draw us into a deeper, more authentic, more fully lived relationship and life with Him, you need permission to be emotionally honest with yourself and with others, because it's from that place of honesty that you can then really cry out to Him. That place of honesty where you're taking away all the bad answers to the bad circumstances and really longing for God Himself and what only He can do. And so I also just love the permission that it gives to us to be fully human in many ways.
Absolutely.
So just kind of a beautiful section of Scripture.
Yeah, that's so good.
So last question for our episode this week. What is something that you hope people will take away from this series?
I have a couple hopes. I'll name two.
Go for it.
Instead of giving you a long list, I think the first one is kind of what we've already been talking about, that, in challenging times and in times of rejoicing, that we can just find that hope in the firm foundation of Jesus. And I hope that also it can give us meaning for the season that we find ourselves in, and to have wisdom to look at our present circumstances through that lens. I think another thing that we can be tempted is to ask this big question of, what is my purpose? What is my purpose in life? And that can be a really big, overwhelming question. But I think the wisdom of Ecclesiastes helps us to ask a different question, more of, when is my purpose? Or what is God doing in me and around me right now, right in 2024 in Lisle, Illinois? And I think it gives us a little bit of wisdom and freedom to ask the Lord, not just what are you doing, but what are you doing right now? And how can I respond to that and live wisely and live with your freedom based on what it is that you're doing in this season? Yeah, I think there's a temptation to live in the future or in the past. Yep. And Ecclesiastes invites us to live fully today. Yes. With God. It's, well, what's God's purpose for you today? Yep. What would He have you do right now? Where you find yourself in this moment. And that really is a beautiful invitation, is to realize that actually each day, even though it is but a day, even though there are seasons, it is still a day that you will get to walk with God. And in whatever the season is, in mountains or valleys, He is there. Yes. And there's an invitation to join Him in whatever the work is that He's doing. So yeah, I would agree. I think that there's a beautiful invitation in this book to attend to what has God called us to right now. Yeah. Where we find ourselves. So. Yeah.
thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love all the conversation.
And of course, I want to invite you all to tune in on the weekends. We are preaching our way through the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you enjoyed the conversation, go back and listen to the weekend messages. Certainly join us on the weekends at any one of our locations. We'd love to see you in person. And our encouragement to you always is to take time to dwell in God's Word together with us. We hope you have a great week.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Trinity podcast. We hope this week's message encouraged you to consider the claims of Jesus in a new way, and we would love to have you join us for worship on the weekend. To find a location near you, visit www.tlc4u.org.